And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Near the end of Terrence Malick's masterpiece movie, The Thin Red Line, there's a monologue that the main character gives in which he says, "Who's killing us, robbing us of life and light, mocking us with the sight of what we might have known? Does our ruin benefit the earth? Does it help the grass to grow or the sun to shine? Is this darkness in you too?" I thought of that tonight. I thought it was kind of fitting for the moment we're in right now in this country, the United States. I feel like even though so much of the energy, so much of what's happening on this stage of the world is being directed by personalities, by men and women, I feel like there's a hand behind all of them, moving them like puppets. I don't mean for this to sound too esoteric or paranormal. I don't really mean it in that sense. I just mean it in the sense that there's this raw just emotion that seems to be sweeping across the world. We've talked about it kind of when COVID kicked off, just the pent-up energy with things manifesting themselves through the riots last summer around the death of George Floyd and similar events like that. It's made me ask myself multiple times, who's doing this? Who's pulling the strings here? It'd be really easy for a religious man to say this is the work of the devil. It's the work of evil. It'd be really easy for a partisan person to say it's the other side. It's the liberals or it's the conservatives. And obviously that's what plays out before our eyes. But without sounding too much like a conspiracy theorist here, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, more and more regularly seems to be validity to most of the conspiracy theories that are taunted and publicized in society. But I really do think that there is a will greater than the human will. It's a collective will almost. Well, not almost. I think it really truly is a collective will of people that is manifest through mouthpieces that are nothing more than pawns on a chessboard, pieces on a chessboard. And to me, that manifests itself more clearly in the past week than in any other time I've seen it in my lifetime in America. So what am I talking about? Obviously, I'm talking about the events in Washington, D.C., the storming of the Capitol, the riots, if you can call them that, in D.C. What I think it was is just a boiling over. I think we throw the word riot around a little bit too casually. The 21st century, compared to what we've seen even in this country, with the civil rights movement, with the anti-war movements, we've had riots. These weren't necessarily riots, but it was a moment in history nonetheless, and it was something that's going to be in textbooks for years. I mean, if you have young children now, no doubt by the time they're in high school, this is going to be worth a couple of pages in their social studies text, because it's never happened before in America. You've never seen a rabble-rousing mob storm a federal building of that scale and just impose their will, granted for a short period of time, but it made a statement that's going to echo down through the years. I don't think in this moment we fully have comprehended what it represents. The first thing that popped into my head when I saw it on TV on Wednesday was the Bastille, the storming of the Bastille in France. And that might sound self-serving, because if you've been listening to this podcast for any time, you know that I've been making comparisons, at least since last summer, between the French Revolution and the current tepid environment in America right now. Obviously, it's not a one-to-one comparison. There's plenty of differences, but just the temperament and the mood of the populace is very similar, eerily similar, in my opinion. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But my point is, when I saw that happen, my mind immediately went to the Bastille, because at the time, nobody really knew with rhyme or reason where the Bastille incident was going to go. It turned out to be the flashpoint that really led to the French Revolution. It was more of a symbolic gesture than anything else. Granted, about 100 people died in the storming of the Bastille, and as of recording this on January 12th, 4 people died in the storming of the U.S. Capitol. So it's different in terms of scale, obviously, but I think the significance is even more profound in this incident than it was in the Bastille. Storming an old prison. This is storming the seat of democracy. Very different. Did you ever think in your lifetime you would see a civilian with animal fur on their head sitting behind the gavel, behind the podium on the House floor? I sure didn't. I mean, anything seems plausible given what we've seen in the last 13, 14 months, but I didn't expect that. And I did see this coming, and not to be self-serving or, sound like a Nostradamus, because I'm certainly not. But I mean, you can go back and listen to the last couple of podcasts. My biggest fear, and the scenario I laid out in terms of how the election might played out almost exactly like I said it would. I mean, go back and listen to it. Exactly what I said would be the worst case scenario is what happened. And here we are. Leading up to January 6th, I saw plenty of posts on Facebook, on Instagram, Twitter, of people talking about how they're going to go to D.C., how they're going to protest and rally. In the modern world, that never ends well, because everybody has a cell phone, everybody has a camera. Like, what's going to happen? Best case scenario, you make a point and become a Wikipedia entry. Worst case scenario, you end up in prison because somebody's got your mug on a personal phone video, and the police are going to use that to track you down. And that's exactly what happened. All these people were rounded up, and a lot of them are going to face multiple federal charges. Their own party, the people that they were supporting, turned on them and basically, used them as cannon fodder, directly or indirectly, which is kind of what I want to talk about, because leading up to this moment, a couple days before, I think I first started hearing January 6th as the date during the last week of December. I was thinking, okay, well, maybe they'll go down, rally, maybe there'll be some riots. I mean, I know the type of people you get in a crowd that big on the right wing. Even in my own family, there's a lot of people that kind of fit the bill of the folks you saw storm the Capitol. So I knew it had the potential to go that direction. I didn't think it would go that far geographically in terms of being able to make it to the steps of the Capitol and then ultimately getting inside. But I thought that type of environment, just in terms of clashing with police and tear gas, pepper spray, people getting pushed back, just random, par for the course type of stuff that we see all the time, usually on the left. But in this case, on the right, I didn't think that would be surprising at all. I expected it. But on the morning of January 6th, when Donald Trump got up behind that podium and started talking, you see the Washington Monument, you see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance, you see a massive crowd gathered in front of him. I didn't know what his plan was, and I don't think he did either. He's kind of like a dog chasing a fire truck. You actually catch up to the truck. What are you going to do? Like, it's just too big. You don't know what to do with it. And I think that's what Trump saw standing in front of him that morning with that massive crowd of people who were pissed off and angry and wanted to take action. 90% of those folks obviously did not want violence and didn't plan to participate in violence, but it doesn't take 90%. I mean, hell, the whole American Revolution was triggered because maybe 25% of the country wanted to revolt from British rule. It doesn't take a majority. It just takes a determined minority, and I think you're going to see more of that actually in the months and years ahead. But in this case, I think Trump, once he saw the energy, once he saw just that he had captured lightning in a bottle that morning, he wanted to see how far he could push it, and I think he also wanted to kind of make it seem like it was worth the while. He didn't want to just do another rally. And I sensed that in his voice and in his delivery. Without basically saying, go storm the Capitol, he basically told them, we're going to march to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer them on. We're going to cheer them on, some more than others, I think is what he said. What do you expect to happen in that case? Like, cheer them on. Come on, man, give me a break. He knew that he had lightning in a bottle that morning, and he knew that he had a crowd that would bend to his will. And there were some folks in that crowd, sure enough, that took his leading, his speech as a dog whistle to go and impose your will. Now, before I go too far down this road and piss off the Trump supporters and the conservatives, I want you to know that this is not going to be me condemning what happened on Wednesday from a right-wing perspective, basically demonizing Trump and the conservatives. We're going to go a very different direction in a moment here. And I'm not naive enough to have it go over my head that most of you disagree with me when it comes to politics, whether it comes to right-wing or left-wing ideas and ideologies. I see the emails. I see that the episode count will go down, the download count, or people tune out mid-episode when I start talking politics sometimes because they feel like I'm attacking their side. That's not the case. I'm a political alien, and I mean this in the truest sense. This isn't like a holier than thou thing, left or right. I think both sides have an extreme wing that is growing larger and larger that I just can't relate to on either side. And I'm not a true centrist, moderate either. I'm kind of just an alien when it comes to politics, and I'll leave it at that for now. But what I'm going to say here is that there are consequences to actions, and more importantly, there's consequences to energy. Energy has to manifest in some way. You can only have pent up kinetic energy in a human bodily form for so long. It has to get out. And that's what Trump's been doing. This whole populist push, this American nationalism that we've seen over the last several years. And I don't blame Trump for this. He's kind of an effect. He's not the cause. Trump came out of this passion that it really started in the Obama years. And I think some of it was rooted in racism. Some of it just rooted in what they perceived to be left-wing policies that were too extreme. And some of it was just built on social media and narratives that were spun and told about people losing their rights. And people felt it. The push for globalism was no joke. Going all the way back to NAFTA and the Clinton administration, we've seen our jobs and our way of life being chipped away year by year, decade by decade, for most of my lifetime anyway. And, people have just had enough. Flyover country in the Midwest, in the Northeast, the Rust Belt where I grew up, people are sick of it. So I don't blame you. If you voted for Donald Trump on those premises, expecting change, I get it. I really get it, man. Like, I do not judge you for that. My only quarrel with the people who voted for Trump expecting brighter days was the people who did it on a religious premise, thinking he was some Cyrus figure or some anointed of God, which is absurd. That was my quarrel, though. It wasn't ever on the hopes of economic change. I've always thought we needed to put an outsider in the White House. Would Trump have been my choice? Absolutely not. But beggars can't be choosers. And we got that. We got an outsider. For better or for worse. And history will sort that out. Some people think he's the greatest thing since the Beatles. Other people think he's the Antichrist. I really don't have a horse in that race. I don't think that what I do know is that he's a narcissist and extremely self-motivated, a self-made man whose ambition is second to none, and his love for himself is second to none. I don't think that's a recipe for success for anybody in the White House, and it makes me nervous that he's got his hands on the nuclear code in that regard. But honestly, when it comes to the war front, he's exceeded my expectations. I mean, he kept his word when he said he wasn't going to get us in any more foreign wars. I think if Hillary had won in 2016, there's a very good chance we would have gone to war with Russia or Iran by now. So credit where credit's due. I think Trump has really exceeded expectations in a lot of ways. But in the one way, the Achilles heel of a Donald Trump is his pride, and the one way that I knew sooner or later he was gonna go down swinging, but go down nonetheless, was when it came to overreaching for the sake of his ego. He could not accept defeat. He could not accept that he was going to be one of the few one-term presidents this country has had, and he couldn't accept, either valid or invalid, the number of votes that were cast. He couldn't accept that Joe Biden would be the next president, and that was a problem. So in the morning of January 6th, Trump's standing in front of that podium. He's got a crowd that he can bend to his will. He says, basically, without telling them to go, start an insurrection, he's basically saying, go out and be the change you want to see. And you can go back and read the manuscript of that. There are a lot of indirect calls, a lot of calls toward taking action. I mean, Rudy Giuliani he did. He stood right up there and basically said, you have to take action. You have to have a physical response. And Trump didn't shoot any of that down. He threw his own vice president, Mike Pence, under the bus, who another person I'm not a fan of at all. But you can't argue with his character. I mean, Pence is a good man. He's somebody who believes what he believes, and he's true to himself. I'll give him that compliment. But his own boss, who he's bent over backwards for the last 4 years, threw him under the bus and basically said, if you don't flip this for me, which he doesn't have the power to do, I'm going to turn on you. And his supporters, took that literally. I mean, there was effigies of Mike Pence being lynched. There were people who allegedly were looking for him in particular, along with Nancy Pelosi and a couple of other members of Congress, to actually execute them. Now, can we prove that? No, of course not. You can't base any sort of argument on hypotheticals, which unfortunately social media has done, which we'll talk about in a moment. But nonetheless, the possibility was there, and it doesn't surprise me at all. So what happens when a demagogue type character, whether Trump is a demagogue or not, I think given the circumstances and the opportunity, he would love to be one. But whether he is one or not in reality, he's been talking like one. And I knew that was going to boil over at some point. And it may not be done, by the way. There's still a week in this. If they do pass the 25th Amendment on Trump, which I don't think is going to happen, but could happen, all bets are off at that point. I think people will take to the streets. And who knows what happens on Inauguration Day or the days leading up to it, or what comes after it for that matter. But Trump knew that he had to make a stand, and that's what happened on the morning of January 6th in Washington, D.C. And now here we are. A bunch of ignorant fools, pawns, got themselves in deeper than they could swim. And a lot of them are going to go to prison for the pride of a wounded man, to paraphrase Mitt Romney. So what happens next? This country is on a road to ripping itself apart. And the thing that irritates me about that is that the two sides ripping each other apart don't realize that they're both being consumed by the same villain, by the same monster. And it's not the other side. Can't you see that? The problem with America right now, the problem in much of the modern world right now, because this isn't just in America. You've got the Yellow Vest movement in France. There's been unrest in England. There's been unrest in Germany. There's been unrest in other parts of Europe and in Asia last year with Hong Kong. I'm not saying it's all the same everywhere, but the enemy is not who you think it is. The enemy is not the liberal, is not the conservative who lives like you, who works a 9-to-5 job, who goes home to their family of 4 and figures out, how to make a meal and how to basically, keep their world revolving. That is not your enemy. You might have different values in terms of things like abortion and gay marriage, they're praying in schools, but there is something so much bigger and so much deeper rooted that you are just a pawn in the grand scheme of things for both of you, both sides. And most people still haven't gotten this, and it's to our own detriment because it's going to rip this country apart. And only there as a corpse, a dying corpse, are we going to realize that we were used, we were played. There are corporations and there are political powers who are benefiting not only monetarily, but in terms of accumulating power and resources for themselves because you're so caught up fighting the other side of the political agenda. And they know it. Most of them are completely agnostic when it comes to politics. They use whatever talking points they need to use to get ahead. And I know you see these folks, right wing or left wing. Let me ask you this. The Republicans have had a majority for several years now in Congress, as well as now on the Supreme Court. And they've done it multiple times in the last few decades. If Roe v. Wade really was a priority for them to overturn, don't you think it would have happened by now? Oh, well, Josh, no, there's middle ground justices like John Roberts who would never be in favor of that. If the motivation was there, if the true drive was truly to overturn Roe v. Wade, the number of donor dollars that goes to people in the cut or in the mold of the Supreme Court justices who are Republicans, or in the mold of your local senators and your congressmen, they would have gotten it done by now. Nobody cares about your pet issue. Roe v. Wade will never be overturned in this country. I promise you it's not going to happen. I don't care if you have all conservative justices in the Supreme Court. It won't happen. Your pet agenda is not the priority for them. The priority for those in power is to keep you fighting each other so that they can accumulate more and more power for themselves. If the Patriot Act didn't wake you up to this in the early 2000s, I don't know what else it's going to take, but honestly believe that something's going to come out of the post-COVID world that none of us can see right now that's going to really pull the rug out from under our feet in terms of owning resources, owning wealth. I mean, some of you have probably heard the World Bank and other organizations talk about this idea of an ownerless world where ownership, at least at the the middle class level, doesn't exist. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. There's some conspiracies that have popped up around that. Like, I might get this wrong. Nassara. I did a little bit of reading on those. There may be some truth to some of it, but I don't think it's anything that devious and diabolical out in the open. I think what it is that you have political entities and you have world leaders and corporate leaders pulling the strings behind the scenes to figure out ways to separate you from your wealth and from your material goods and to put them in their own pockets. It's as simple as that. It's a story as old as time. Take from the poor, give it to the rich. And it's happening. It's happening at an accelerated pace right now. We talked about a K-shaped recovery. After the stock market crashed back in March of 2020, it bounced right back in a big way. And I thought that it might. So I positioned myself in my own investments to take advantage of that. Obviously not nearly as much as many did. But it turned out to be the right bet. And it paid off nice in 2020 for anybody who was, shrewd enough to play the market, knowing that it was going to come back and not crash. But there were people who knew all along that that was going to happen. I mean, Kelly Loeffler, who just lost in Georgia, many of you may have forgotten this already. When she found out about COVID right before the shutdowns, what was the first thing she and her husband did? They went and made stock trades. They knew that there was going to be an opportunity to sell high and buy low, and that's exactly what they did. It's not just a Republican thing. It's happened all over the place. And it's mostly behind the shadows with people who you don't even know the names of. I mean, the George Soros of the world, yes, but there are many like that who you don't hear about. And this is only accelerating. The only intention of these people is to keep you in chains and to keep you subservient, because as long as you're a mindless consumer, as long as you're hating the other side, as long as you're miserable with your life, you're going to keep buying things to try to fill that hole in your life. You're going to keep spending money to make a statement or to make your voice heard, to support a cause. And all that does is thicken the pockets and thicken the holdings of those who want it for themselves. They take advantage of your good intentions and your righteous indignation, and they use it to make themselves wealthy. Fat cats have always done it. And until you figure that out, there's not much you can do. So I want to transition from the Capitol because I don't know what's going to happen next. This is really going to change moment by moment. I think in the next few days, things might really pop off. If they do impeach Trump again, I expect some unrest and protests in capitals and major cities around the country. I don't know the extent of it. I'm done underestimating things. It could get as bad as you can imagine. I really don't know. Do I see a full-scale civil war, organized resistance? No, because there is no organization to this, and that's what we saw at the Capitol. This was not a coup attempt. This was not an attempt to overthrow the government. Would they have liked that result? Sure, but they didn't expect that result. This was just anger and frustration boiling over, much like we've seen from Antifa in years past. There was no leadership. There's no organization. It was just Donald Trump riling up the masses, spinning them like a top, and then letting them go. He wanted to see what would happen, and he was basically, that was his equivalent of throwing a Hail Mary. And he got a pass interference call. Offensive pass interference call, that is. It didn't work out. What happens next is anybody's guess. But Donald Trump, if you hate him, fine. If you love him, fine. But please, whatever you do, see beyond the shadows on the wall. Stop looking at the man on the stage, because it is not about that. You're going to have your shirt ripped off your back in the coming years if you keep seeing this as a left versus right issue. This is an us versus them issue, but it is not left versus right. It's much more nefarious, and the enemy is much stronger. Speaking of which, let's talk about tech censorship. Because what was the result of this? Something so sweeping. It was almost like what Rahm Emanuel said during the Obama years, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, I think the left saw an opportunity here to jump all over individual rights when they saw what the Trump supporters did in the Capitol. They basically said, let's use this opportunity to shut these people down. So what they did was they took the most loud and quote unquote quote unquote violence inciting voices within that community, and they basically just shut them down. Lifetime bans on Twitter. I've seen plenty of YouTube channels that I follow, podcasts that I follow, people on Twitter saying that they lost countless of followers. Countless. Like, I'm talking 10, 20, even 50,000 in a matter of hours. And that's because all those accounts were closed and people were shut down, just flat out unpersoned, ghosted like Alex Jones. Donald Trump being first among them. First time in history that a sitting president has been blacklisted like that. Nothing close has even happened before. And I don't think it's going to stop there. I think there's going to be a great purge. It may not happen tomorrow. It may not even happen in the coming weeks. But this is not the end of this. I promise you that. So it raises the question of power. Does social media have the right? Does Twitter, does Facebook, do these other tech giants have the right to silence you, to take away your voice? The true free market person would say yes, of course they do. It's a private company. They have rules and guidelines, which you allegedly read, but of course nobody reads them. But you sign off on them so that you can use that product. And if you violate them, they have the right to close your account. 90% of the time, I agree with that. No questions asked. You sign up for it. You agree to the terms of service. Live by them. But what's made me really start to evaluate that in the last few days, and granted, I've been going down this road with social media tech giants for a few years because of the role I think they play in society. But what really set me off in a more absolutist sense in the last couple of days was not Donald Trump being censored. It was what happened to Parler. I don't know if you follow this, but Parler, the alternative social media site, which basically is Wish version of Facebook. It's like generic Facebook without censorship. So people, especially on the right, love it because they can go there and speak freely, which is great. I don't use Parler myself, but I mean, that's great. If that's what they want to basically build a brand on, if they want to have that outlet of unadulterated freedom of speech, I support that all day long. The problem is the competitors, all the other tech giants, do not support that. And I'm not just talking competitors in the social media space. No. It wasn't just Twitter. It wasn't just Facebook or Instagram. You had Amazon and their web hosting service, AWS, tell them they can't use their services anymore to host their website. Okay, so now I got to find a new server. Well, guess what? You can't do that because all the other big players also said we're not going to host your services either. Not only that, Apple says we're not going to list your product or your app in our app store. Google says the same thing. So there goes Apple, there goes Android. Basically, your company's dead in the water. What we learned in the last few days is that these liberal tech giants have the ability to literally bankrupt a company that they disagree with. If you aren't woke enough, if you don't support their agenda, they can end you. They can commit the equivalent of corporate murder. All because they don't like you and what you stand for. That's a big, I'm not going to cuss here, but that's a big problem. That's a big problem. And this is why I think these companies need to be broken up and treated like public utilities. You say, how can you say that? That's socialism, Josh. How can you say that? That's anti-everything that you claim to believe in terms of free market principles. Well, you know what? Teddy Roosevelt, who was no liberal, was a trust buster in the early 1900s because he saw the power that some of these monopolies wielded in society, and he knew the harm that it did. We are in that age with the social media companies. If you think this is just fear-mongering and hyperbole, you're nuts. Look around you. These companies have gotten so big. Most people invest more time, not most, but a large, sizable portion of developed society invest more time in developing their social life and communicating through their social network than they do in real life. And I don't think that's an understatement. Most people, especially millennials and younger, communicate more, invest more, market their brand more, and try to build business and sources of income more through social media than they do through real world relationships. So you can effectively end somebody if you silence them through social media platforms. I'm advocating for an internet bill of rights. This is something that should have been done years ago, but it definitely needs to happen now. The days of this wild, wild west approach to just figuring it out as it goes on the internet needs to end now. Otherwise, the internet is going to become an overly regulated place. The pendulum's going to swing in the other way, and all the power is going to go to the ones in charge. And you're not going to like it if you're a conservative. You're really not going to like it because the ones in charge are all liberals. It's just the way it is, man. The cookie crumbled that way. Silicon Valley, tech giants, 90% of them are woke liberals. So if you don't like it, you better do something about it now, because if you don't fight for it, you are going to lose your voice and all of your rights when it comes to the most important platform you have in the 21st century, which is social media. That includes podcasting, by the way. All of this can be censored on a whim. And if you think it can't, just look around you, because it's happening. Alex Jones was the canary in the coal mine in 2018. I said it then. You can hate Alex Jones. You can disagree with what he says. On a personal level, I don't have an issue with Alex Jones. I listened to his show for years, like back in the early 2010s to 2014 or 15. I listened to InfoWars a lot, mostly for entertainment value, but some of the stuff he did break news sometimes, and there's always a kernel of truth to most of what he said. But I get the people in the vitriol, especially after Sandy Hook, the people that hated him. But I always said, no matter what, you cannot silence him. You can't, because the precedent is set. Once you silence somebody, when the table is turned, and it will always be turned, as we see in Washington every 4 to 8 years, then they can do the same to you, and they can take it a step further. Well, Silicon Valley is a monopoly right now, controlled by liberals. And we know what the counter reaction is going to be. If they keep silencing these right-wing voices, there's going to be entrepreneurs and tech-minded people on the right that go out and basically create their own internet. They're going to go create their own web hosting service companies. They're going to create their own social media companies. And they're going to basically have a blue internet and a red internet. And they're never going to talk to each other. They're just going to talk crap about each other. And that's going to draw the divide in this country even deeper. It's going to put a wedge between us that is irreparable. And it may already be irreparable, but it's only going to get worse. And if we continue to separate, if we can't come together in the public square and have real dialogue without storming the Capitol or without burning cities, we're going to have real problems in the years ahead. I don't think America has it in it to organize a true civil war, and I don't think we even should, because again, I don't think the true enemy is left versus right. I think it's the haves versus the have-nots in this country, and that's going to become clearer and clearer in the months and years ahead. I don't think we have the will. We're very apathetic people, so I don't think we have the will to have a true civil war. But I do think that we could have some chaos, much like, again, the French Revolution, where the Jacobins rise up and you start chopping off heads on the guillotine. I mean, it was just a couple of months ago, maybe like 3 or 4 months ago now, somebody set up a mock guillotine in front of one of the homes of Jeff Bezos. And if that's not a harbinger of what might be coming, I don't know what is. And then you get something that mirrors what happened at the Bastille in 1789. We are on that road. And if you have been writing me off, or if you've been disregarding that we are on the road of the French-style revolution here in America, you're just not listening. You're not paying attention. Look around you. The anger, the resentment against those in power, against the ruling class, against the hidden elite. That's at its core. That's really what this right-wing resistance to the election is. People think that there's a liberal and a left-wing cabal that's basically pulling the strings. All these manufactured votes, they said, that came out of nowhere, the Dominion voting machines. They're basically, what they're telling you is that they think there's a higher power, a shadow government, that basically failed in 2016, and this time they got the job done right, and they made sure that Trump didn't get reelected. And all you're doing by silencing them, by shutting them down on social media in the name of not incentivizing violence or inciting violence, all you're doing is making them more angry, more hostile, and you're also confirming their beliefs. You're confirming that there is a cabal, that there is a conglomerate of liberal-minded people behind the scenes trying to control things. This week, if anything, has just made them dig their heels in further. Everyone needs to shift their eyes before it's too late and realize who your enemy is. Know your enemy. Your enemy is not the person on the other side of the aisle. It's not the gay or trans person who wants equal rights. It's not the conservative who wants to stop murdering babies. Keep those issues. I'm not saying to give up your beliefs. I'm saying don't tear apart the country over them. We have had people on both sides of all those arguments for decades, and we've survived. We've thrived even. What's tearing us apart is the ever-growing whittling out of the middle class, the ever-growing divide between the haves and the have-nots. That's why the tension is boiling over. People are seeing other people eat while they have nothing, and they're pissed off about it. And if you can't see that, You're going to have to see it when you have to embrace it, when you have to live through it, when you have to see heads getting chopped off, all because an angry, rabble-rousing crowd got their hands on somebody that they deemed to be the enemy. Those days will come, and they're not too far off. If you think that can't happen in America, read your history. There will be blood in the streets. Madame Guillotine can definitely live again. Maybe it'll be a different mechanism. I say that kind of as a metaphor, but we are repeating and echoing those same old storylines. And if we don't wake up to it, it's going to be too late. We need a new Bill of Rights. We need to fix the social media problem first and foremost, because that's what's just stoking these fires above all else is the ability to just spew hatred and misinformation and dissent through social media. We need to fix that first. So this new Bill of Rights has to be priority number one. I don't know if it'll happen under a Biden administration. It doesn't seem like the motivation's there. It seems like the left is digging in their heels as well because they think they have this righteous indignation where they can just silence the right-wing devils. That's going to be a problem if they stick to that ground because both sides are just growing more and more fierce. There needs to be a coming together, a meeting of the minds, just like Jefferson and Franklin and Adams and all the others, Hancock. You need to get a group of tech-savvy people together who can write an internet Bill of Rights because freedom of speech needs to cross over into social media. If it doesn't, which it obviously doesn't right now, it's never going to work. You can't have freedom of speech in the streets and not have it on social media because most people live more of their real life now on social media than they do in the streets. We need to figure out who we're going to be as a people. Is this going to be an oligarchy run by a few elites at the top who impose their will on the rest of us? Or is this going to be a true, equal, representative democracy where everybody has a say, where every opinion is accepted? It doesn't have to be embraced and valued, but it has to be spoken. It has to be accepted. It has to be allowed to live. We can't just keep killing the baby in the cradle, which is what we're trying to do right now. Alex Jones, Donald Trump, it's not going to end. It's just going to keep coming and coming. All you're going to do is cut off one head of the hydra and two more will rise in its place. Know your enemy before it's too late. So to wrap things up, let's talk about what I think is going to happen next, what you need to prepare for. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do think that it doesn't take a genius to see the tension is going to boil over. I think the rest of January and going into February could be a really trying time in this country in terms of social unrest, COVID still being kind of out of control. All those things they're going to combine and coalesce to really create a sticky situation. So be careful. Don't get swept up in these protests. I would say don't even venture out into the streets to participate in those things. You're just going to turn yourself into a statistic. Be shrewd, be wise. The time may come to bear arms, but this is not it. This is not it yet. This is the time for trying to forge a new path, for making a new way. Like I said, an internet Bill of Rights. If it comes to pass that America's differences truly are irreconcilable, well, then maybe the conversation changes. Maybe my advice changes. But that's not where we're at right now. Right now, we're at a place where we need to be wise as serpents. We need to be very intentional about the words we say and the actions we take. And we need to find a way to heal old wounds. Otherwise, we will bleed out. Barring any sort of rational meeting of the minds, what's going to happen is the Biden administration is going to take office later this month. And they're going to either quietly or not so quietly, I don't think it matters, the result and the outcome will be the same. They're going to continue to silence conservative voices. They're going to cement themselves in positions of power. They're going to give these tech giants rewards for doing what they thought was the right thing to do, was permanently banning Donald Trump. They're going to reward them by giving them more power, more control. Look for that in the small print of large legislation bills that will come up in 2021 and beyond. And they're going to try to consolidate power. They're going to try to do what's been going on for years now. Continue to centralize power with a ruling elite class. You've got to put your body on the wheel, and you've got to find a way to stop that and prevent it from happening. Because if we don't figure out how to stop that and it continues to accelerate, then it will be game over. But right now, I still have hope that there can be a meeting of the minds and that there can be a compromise if we just establish new legislation. Again, a Bill of Rights in terms of what constitutes free speech and how to conduct yourself on the internet and what rights you have on the internet. So be mindful of that. Figure out ways. Some of you far smarter than me, some of you in legal circles might be able to really make things happen in that world. So keep your ear to the ground and look for that. Continue to call for that to happen. And if it doesn't happen, well, then we circle the wagons and figure out what comes next. But we will lose this country. We will lose liberal democracy in the world entirely if we don't make a stand here. I truly believe that. Censorship should never be embraced in America. I don't have to agree with what you say. I don't have to accept it as truth for myself, but I need to let it live, because that's what makes democracy so great. Alternative, dissenting opinions. Stop seeing your enemy, your political enemy, as an adversary, because they're not. At the end of the day, we're neighbors. We literally live next door to each other. Don't burn down the neighborhood. We lived in peace for years, so stop listening to the people that tell you that we can't do it. We can, we just don't want to. And we don't feel like we have to because we're entitled and we feel like everybody should think like we think. One of the bastard children of social media as well. So let's find a new way. Let's chart a new course. Otherwise, there's going to be more situations like what we saw last week at the Capitol. There's going to be more uprisings, more burnings and protests and effigies being dragged through the streets, and things like what happened with the riots with George Floyd last year. You're going to see more of the same. It's this more of the same and more of the same and more of the same, more shootings, more bombings, etc., if we don't make a stand now. And at one point, if we don't make a stand, the final straw on the camel's back will bring down the Republic. To quote, what is it, Padme from the first or second Star Wars movie? This is how democracy dies, with thunderous applause. I think that's true. I definitely embrace that as much as I ever have right now. Democracy dies with rousing, thunderous applause. The number of people who cheered Twitter on as they give a lifetime ban to Donald Trump, it makes me sick, because these people don't know what they're doing. They don't realize that one day the tables will be turned on them. Know your enemy. That's the first step in being able to resist them. And we need to do it now, because each day we wait, each day we're caught up on these petty quarrels amongst ourselves, is another day that they could continue to accumulate and consolidate power and resources for themselves. Realize that while you still can and while you can still do something about it. Take care, everybody. We'll talk soon.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop.